Those are our 3 panelists for today, and we have 5 questions lined up for you. Depending on how long they talk, maybe we'll get to all 5, we'll see. First one, are you guys ready? Why is the rule of law so important in protecting our freedoms, both personal and economic, in a free society?
I'll take that one. First of all, I think what's always important is to start off with what law is. And I kind of boil law down to its basic. It is the rules by which society decides to exercise violence. And that always sounds a little funny, so I was thinking maybe I should say exercise a coercion force, but let's be realistic, it's violence. And if we don't have good rules, then we don't know how that violence is going to be exercised. We don't know if our property is safe. We don't know what freedoms we have. And we don't know what restrains the people who we expect to exercise the violence at the end of the day. So the rule of law is absolutely important, that every one of us gets liberty from making sure law is good. It's interesting. I was over in DC and I saw on the Justice Building that law gives us, what is it? A law gives us liberty. And I kind of didn't like that, because I don't think that's exactly true. I think the people give us there. But by making sure our laws are good, making sure the rule actually comes from we the people, it protects our stuff, that it is an ordered liberty, and make sure that we get the liberty preserved. So that's how I hate it.
Following up on that, Marshall's right about where the rule of law comes from. But tying it into the economic standpoint, what the rule of law does is it gives all of you out there who are in business, who are business owners, but even as consumers, it gives you certainty. It gives you expectations that you can rely on. Because what the rule of law does is it means that law doesn't change with whoever's in power. The law stays consistent from person to person who exercises that power, who exercises that authority, and the law only changes through set means that we know ahead of time is how it's going to change. You don't just wake up in the morning and, oh, law's different. And so what the rule of law is it means that when you're a business owner, you can go out there and contract for the purchase of goods or services. You might engage even in a future contract, let's say futures contract for commodities. Those contracts only work, they only exist because there's certainty in the law that 3 years from now, 4 years from now, when that contract becomes due, it's going to be enforced. It's still going to be as good as the paper that it's written on, because the paper that it's written on is backed up by the state, which is all of us. All of us have agreed that that's going to work out, that those are the rules that we're going to play by. So the rule of law, it's so important to our economic functioning, because without the rule of law, there'd be no economy, there'd be no growth. We'd just be bartering individual to individual.
And I think one of the key factors of the law that a lot of people don't realize is it's really about relationships. And the free market system is built on that, the trust in those relationships. So if we can't trust, if we have a breach of those trusts, we have to find a way to remedy that, restore that trust in those relationships. And that's essentially when Marshall was talking about the force that's applied by law. That's really true. The law doesn't come in and actually create the relationships. The free market does. What it does is it protects those relationships by saying these are the rules that are going to be enforced, and if you break these rules, then you're going to pay the price for. So without that, you lose confidence, and that's essentially what Judge Van Winkle was talking about. Without that confidence, it's just going to stall out. It's not going to work.
Thank you all. That was their first question. A huge round of applause for them. They told me they were a little bit nervous before, right? I wasn't nervous at all. We have another question talking about the confidence of the individual in relationship to law. So how do we know when the government passes a new law that is for our safety or for fairness? How do we know that we can tell they're actually protecting the people? Or if they're just, if I want to make sure I have the right word here, limiting our freedom to make choices?
Yeah, I guess I'll start first on that one too. I think the question of every law is whether or not it comes from the fundamentals of who we are as a people. You know, one of the wonderful things we have in our nation that is not true throughout the rest of most of history until we came here is that starting verbiage in our Constitution, we the people. And that was actually revolutionary language. That was an overthrow of the states' governments. That was an overthrow of the sovereignty of Britain. It was we the people are establishing sovereignty and making this government. And so the ultimate thing of whether or not a law establishes freedom, establishes liberty, is what we want to say as ordered them. Because liberty doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It must have order and structure. And whether it's supporting that is whether or not it comes from we the people at the end of the day. And we start that off with our political process, which is absolutely important, but it also has to go back to the history of who we are as people. You know, you can tell a good law versus a bad one based on whether or not you sit there and go, you know, that just doesn't fit with me. There's something that just seems unjust, because there is a justice written on the hearts of who we are. You know, every one of us has it, and you can tell whether it's in some, you know, one of the cases I recently put an amicus on was on whether or not there was too much racism in the midst of a case and the way it went out. And you can just tell there's something wrong with it. It just doesn't feel. And so there is ultimately good in law. There is a natural in the hearts of us where it's found. And we come from we the people. And so to answer the question whether or not I personally think a law is good or bad, you know, sometimes you can look at it and say, does it come from we the people? Does it come from our hearts, or is it someone making it up to restrict us that doesn't actually come from the hearts? And so I think it starts with the political process being our representatives, them voting on it, all that kind of stuff comes through the prep process. But equally, it should reflect who we are as people and ultimately tug on the string of justice and silence.
And on the second part of that question is whether or not a law, whether it's a good law or a bad law. And one of the suggestions in that question is a bad law is one that just restricts our liberty. And that's true up to a point. All laws restrict our liberty. That is the point of law, is to restrict our liberty. But as to what end does it restrict our liberty? There's a very famous psychological study that was done several decades ago. It's called the Playground Study. And they found that kids on a playground, if the playground was fenced in, the kids would use the whole playground and go out to the edges of the playground. They would run free within the playground. But if a playground wasn't fenced, if they had total freedom, the kids would actually cluster together. They wouldn't use the whole playground. They wouldn't go out to the edges. They wouldn't use the full extent of their liberty. And so what the law is when it restricts our liberty, if it's a good law, it'll restrict our liberty in a way that we have confidence that we can utilize the full extent of our liberty. It's a bad law if it restricts our liberty further than we'd like. No one wants to be in a playground that's a 3x3 postage stamp. You want to be in a big playground where you can go and have fun and meet with other people and interact with other people. So one way of looking at it is to go back to being a little kid. What's a good law or is a bad law? Is it one that lets you do what you want to do, lets you do what you need to do in a way that doesn't interfere with others, doesn't hurt others? So not all restrictions on liberty are bad if it gives us the confidence that we need to exercise that liberty.
Well, I'm going to jump in, cut you off. No, to pick up on Judge Van Winkle's statement, one of the things you can also tell is a good law or bad law is how often it's violated. You know, it's interesting. If a law is violated a lot, it probably means that we as a people are not thinking it's actually that important of a law. And so if laws are violated on a regular basis, then it may not be something that we may want to reconsider it as a law. And that's just one thing you're bringing up with the playground. So
I think you can look at a law and see what's the purpose behind it. And so I'd be suspect of anything that has a social agenda, because at that point in time, essentially the government's trying to control relationships. And that, to me, violates constitutional principles. I think what Judge Van Winkle was talking about is there's always going to be some restrictions on liberty, But the question is, does that improve the ability to move within that playground? Does that improve your ability to actually exercise your liberty properly? Because if I'm exercising my liberty and it's impinging on somebody else, well, that's not working. That's not going to work for our society. We don't have a free society at that point in time. So if I feel like in my liberty, I can come take your property, that's not true liberty, you know? So the idea is the equal application of law is going to promote the overall liberty of each individual in society. The question becomes, is that something that allows us to freely assemble or improve free speech, improve our chance or opportunity to do things like use our intelligence, use our skills, be able to trade those things, improve society? Or is it something where the government's coming in and now trying to control our freedom of assembly, trying to control our thoughts?
And Judge Van Winkle, I love your fences and playgrounds examples. Believe it or not, I was a very small kindergartner, and I had this big bad first grader was bullying me, so I'm very familiar with what the context looks like when laws in this example can go out of hand. So I wanted to ask you, courts are often asked to decide whether a law goes too far, like my kindergarten bully was. What principles guide judges in making these decisions?
Well, the principles that guide judges, the first thing is that those principles should be different from the principles that guide legislators on what makes a good law or a bad law. As a judge, all that I am concerned with is the backstop of our Constitution. My involvement in legislating and determining whether a law is good or bad is not whether it's good policy or bad policy, whether it's doing what the legislature wanted it to do or not. My job starts and stops at our Constitution of whether or not our Constitution authorizes it. If it does, my job ends. That's my check on the other branches of government, is to make sure that the Constitution isn't violated. Now, in the legislature, their job is to say, not just, okay, is this law constitutional? Can we pass this law? But does it do what we want to do? Is this good policy? And as a judge, not my bailiwick. I stay out of that.
And from a lawyer perspective,
Yeah.
what would that look
No,
like?
I'm going to throw in something, though, from a lawyer perspective. One, I was talking with a gentleman today on different cases, and he was saying, well, I wish the Supreme Court would just tell us how to do this thing. And he's got the case going up there, and he's like, I hope they tell me about this. And I go, they can't tell you about that because that's not part of the facts of your case. The courts are not supposed to give advisory opinions on how to. They're stuck within the facts of the case. And the way our court system works is someone like Judge Van Winkle handles it first and handles the creative aspects of it. But by the time it makes it to the Supreme Court, they can't touch anything that he didn't. And so there's a bit of, we want our courts to solve a lot of stuff, but our courts are built on a foundation of case by case and reality of conflicts. I mean, they don't deal inside hypotheticals, although sometimes they do. But I remember one judge asking me, well, Mr. Casey, how would you deal with this hypothetical? And I just said, Your Honor, you're not a legislator. You don't get to deal in hypotheticals. This is the reality of what we have in front of us. I'll answer your question because I respect you, but this is what we're dealing with. And so courts, as we go through the legal system, they're bound by what they have. And certain judges at times have gone outside that, and they end up losing their authority and their power when they speak outside the facts they have. And so that's another thing that not just the Constitution finding that, but you may ask, why don't you have a decision on this? Well, maybe because those facts haven't arisen. And maybe those facts haven't arisen because someone doesn't want to be crazy enough to create those facts and run into the problem. So sometimes in our court system, we haven't dealt with things. And it's interesting, even a law that is, 15 years old is still new because of the facts and the development of case law just hasn't been.
I want to follow up on what Marshall is saying. So last week we were over in the Bellevue area. We're doing this panel, and I had Judge Dave Larson as one of our panelists. You're probably familiar with him. He's spent a long time judging our state, well respected, ran for our state Supreme Court. But Dave Larson was able to point out from his experience why it's so important that judges only answer the questions that they were meant to answer. And he pointed out his experience living here in Washington. back when Roe v. Wade was decided. So when Roe v. Wade was decided, that legalized abortion nationwide, hot button topic. But before Roe v. Wade started, Washington, through the popular initiative process, had actually legalized abortion in this state. And one of the things that you saw that was different was after Roe v. Wade, you saw people demonstrating in this country and states that didn't have a choice. They didn't get to say in on that issue of whether or not abortion should be legal in their state or not. But in Washington, when we passed it by popular initiative, a lot of people didn't like it, but people respected it. They didn't have that demonstration in the streets because it went through the democratic process. It went through the proper channels. And so when you take things to courts and ask courts to answer questions that they're not supposed to do, that's when we start getting people demonstrating in the streets, people trying to rebel. And it doesn't matter if you've got a liberal court or a conservative court, when you have courts making that policy that they're not supposed to, people lose respect for the courts, they lose respect for judges, and they lose respect for government overall. And that makes all of us less safe.
And I'm just going to add into that. One of the things we're talking about is some person, one of the individuals in our society has to bring a case into the court system. Judges just can't make decisions without that. And so what that is that's essentially part of our representative republic, where you get to bring that in saying, the government has harmed me. In other words, they've done something unconstitutional with this law. It's harmed me. Now asking you to make a decision on that. And Marshall's right. Superior Court judges are more important than I think we realize. We always think about Supreme Court judges, but by the time it gets up to the Supreme Court, all the facts that are going to be in front of that Supreme Court are decided in front of that Superior Court judge. So when that happens, that Superior Court judge has to really look at what's going on in these circumstances here, in this case here. And again, going to what Andrew was saying, is that is keeps the situation from becoming anarchy, where the judge is now legislating saying, you know what, I'd really like to change everything about this policy. No, it's really specific to what was the harm that happened to this individual, and that individual may be standing for others in society as well. But the idea is it still follows that representative republic as we move forward and protecting the rights of the individuals.
So we've talked so far about individual rights, we've mentioned state rights, now let's take it up to a federal notch. So how do we know, and how does the Constitution limit government power, and why is the balance so essential to maintaining justice and liberty for the individual and for the state?
That is a lot there. I'm going to have you repeat that question in a little bit, but we'll start out with the first part. How does the Constitution government limit power, or Constitution and limit government power? Well, the first thing that it does is it tells you what the government can and can't do. That's the whole point of the Constitution, is it is the guiding rules, it's the rules of the road for the government, and then from there the government fills in all the other rules. But most importantly, the Constitution, whether it's the federal Constitution or the state Constitution, it brings you back to the people. And it's a reminder that at the end of the day, all government power is derived from the people. We don't have a government whose power is derived from a king. We don't have a government whose power is derived directly from God, might be divinely inspired, but it's not directly from God where our government got that power. We got it from the people. But the other thing that it does is the Constitution, it also tells us what level of government is the appropriate level of government to do things. As you know, we have a whole lot of governments. Anytime you look at your property tax bill and you look at where your property taxes go to, it goes to a whole lot of different governments. It goes to irrigation districts. It goes to public utility districts. If you have a public utility district, it goes to your city. It goes to your county. It goes to your local school district. It goes to the state government. It goes to the federal government. It goes to the county, if I didn't already say that. Might go to a water drainage district or water district or diking district. All these little things. Well, each of these government has a little piece of power that it gets to exercise that no other government gets to do. And so what your Constitution does is it tells each of these governments, you get to deal with this, you get to deal with that, and so you don't step on each other's toes. But in theory, the Constitutions also divvy out that power to the layers of government that are most suited to do that. You don't want the federal government paving Garland Avenue here in Spokane, Washington, because the federal government doesn't know anything about Garland. We leave it to the city.
And that concept is called federalism. A lot of people misunderstand it, and what it means is really the states have the broadest rights and plenary rights, and so the federal government only has delegated right, powered. Okay, and that's one of the concepts I don't think most people understand today. Is our Constitution actually constrains our federal government? It's not really higher. It's just that in what's been delegated to it stays with the federal government. But the states have a tremendous amount of rights, and they are closer to the people. And then you look at that, and you have the Constitution in the state. And again, as Judge Van Winkle was pointing out, in our Constitution, it says every action by our government should be for the benefit of the rights of the individuals in this state. So when you're looking at the laws that are being passed, hopefully they're being passed with that purpose. And then you look at the lower government or the smaller governments, like the municipal governments Judge Van Winkle was talking about. Again, they're closer to the people. They're more limited in the power that they can exercise. But in that responsibility, they're also closer to us. So a water district, well, I probably know the person who is actually part of that, or, on that board for the water district. And so I have more input, more say. The whole point of the Constitution, though, is to make sure that the power that is exercised is closest to the people, protecting the people and protecting individual rights.
And I want to follow up with what Mr. Casey just said. Some of the things we forget is in the federalism that we have a separation of powers in our federal government. So we talk about that a lot. We've got an executive branch, we've got a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. We have that in the state too. But we have a different separation of powers that we often forget about between the federal government and the state. They're separated too, and they also can't do the powers of the other and are meant to conflict. And so one of the best ways our constitutions, because we have two in Washington, we've got our federal constitution and our state constitution, they protect liberty by creating a conflict in our government. So our government has to learn to work together, because one of the famous quotes from Madison is, "Men are not angels. If we were, we wouldn't need government." So our first duty is to create a government to restrain ourselves, and the second duty is to restrain the government by separating its powers so it restrains itself. And we do that among the branches, and we do that among the federal and the state. But one of the fun things I think about in the separation of powers is our federal constitution was created for a completely different reason than our state constitution. If we look at why our state constitution was created, we weren't as concerned about creating an effective government. Like with the federal constitution, they were concerned about creating an effective government. That's why it says, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility," and many of the other things. Our constitution in Washington state starts out with thanks to our creator for the blessings of our liberties. And the difference is, the difference is our state constitution was created because we were fearful of actually too powerful of a government that could be co-opted and overcome by special interests of corporations or special interests of people. So we actually created more of a diffuse government where we don't even have a single executive branch. Our governor is the head of the executive branch, but we have different people who are independently elected to that executive branch, where that's not in the federal government. So we have a lot more stuff in the state government to restrain such as initiatives, such as many of that stuff that aren't there, because they have different purposes. And so that's another thing that protects our liberty, is the different purposes in our constitutions.
So then if I can summarize it simply to the non-lawyers maybe, like myself, then would federalism be one of the biggest things that the Constitution implements to help maintain our individual and state justice and liberty? Am I correct in saying that, or is there something else?
I would definitely say so. I think the idea that Marshall was talking about is that you have this conflict that's inherent between, for example, our U.S. Constitution and the Washington State Constitution. And that's on purpose. so that there is restraint that's being operated. And that's what we talk about, our individual, yes.
Thank you. Any other advice? Okay. Moving on to the next question here. What is the best way to stay informed and engaged in understanding how the law affects our everyday lives for Washingtonians and for people in Spokane? The best one. And you could have more than one if you think.
All right, well, I'll start out with a shameless plug for our sponsor, the Washington Policy Center.
Yes.
If you're here tonight, you know about the Washington Policy Center. You know what they do. I was telling someone tonight, they asked, "Oh, how do you know about the Washington Policy Center?" Well, I first learned about the Washington Policy Center as a young 18-year-old legislative aide down in Olympia working for our state Senate. People from the Washington Policy Center would come around with reports talking about things that were working or not working. And it is that work, it is that independent work of an organization that is focused on the state of Washington, not on the federal government, not at the national level that so much of the media is, but it's an organization that's focused on the state of the Washington, keeping tabs on legislation that gets passed and following up to say, hey, is this legislation working or not working, and putting out wonderful reports in a nonpartisan, independent, non-biased, they just say, here's the facts. Do what you will with them, but here's the facts. So that is one of the single best ways to learn about and stay involved with knowing what's going on with your government and the new laws. And no, Washington Policy Center didn't ask me to say that, but I just can't say enough. As a young 18-year-old, I was impressed by this organization, and now later as a judge, I'm still impressed by it.
I'm going to follow that up with the Washington Policy Center is exactly what Judge Van Winkle was talking about. And I think, honestly, there's so many different areas that we can be concerned about, and it's hard to stay involved in everything. So my thought is, especially as a younger person, figure out one or two things that they're really close to your heart, whether it's religious freedom, whether it's gun rights, whether it's free speech, free trade, whatever it is, and then try to follow what's happening and use the Washington Policy Center to figure out what's happening in that area. Then when you kind of get familiar with what's happening in that particular area of the laws that are getting passed, you're going to notice it becomes easier to understand what's happening with the legislature and being able to read the bills. I know that's probably difficult for most people, but once you get it down, it's not really that difficult. So just getting the interest and not being overwhelmed at first, I think, is kind of the first step. After that, being involved in something like the Young Professionals, where you get a chance to actually discuss some of this information with other people who are like-minded, who are actually interested. At that point in time, you now start trading information, and you're also going to be caught up to speed on other bills that are passed. And frankly, I think my passion has grown through networking with other people and finding out other interests that I'm also interested in as well. So.
I'm sorry, I really don't have a comment on this one because I find it weird that it wouldn't stay up on the law. So I don't know how to advise you.
Well, so
because this is what I love to do.
Well, Marshall's being a little shy there. Marshall, he listens to podcasts. He listens to a lot of other things, but so Marshall does have his sources to keep up on the news. I'll give you a few more sources. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever received was consume multiple sources of media. And to this day, I still do that. And so it's increasingly hard to keep up on that in Washington state because there are fewer and fewer media sources covering Washington state. But at the national level, one, I read the Spokesman every morning cover to cover. I watch Fox News, I watch CNN, I listen to NPR, but most importantly, I also cover foreign media. I regularly go to the BBC and see what BBC is covering about the United States, what's being covered, what's not being covered. Because when you consume multiple sources of media, you might not like all those sources of media and the drivel that they put on the air or in print. I certainly don't all the time, but I am always stunned by the way that the same story gets covered or not covered by different organizations. And that's the only way that you're going to get close to the truth. You still won't know the truth because you're not there. You're not experiencing it. You won't know. But the closest that you can get to the truth is to consume media from multiple different sources. When you see on Fox News people talking about the war on Christmas and someone's HOA run amok going after some HOA person who just wants to bring joy to their neighborhood, and then you go to another news source that doesn't talk about the war on Christmas. They talk about this whack job who won't let his neighbor sleep and his HOA is ticked off at him. There's two sides to every story, but each of those news sources is only covering one of those sides. And so you have to cover that. And it's also important to get out of the United States and see what others are saying about the United States as well.
Thank you very much. We do need to hear that today and really appreciate you giving that advice. And I wanted to ask you guys two big takeaways on behalf of young professionals. We have many young professionals here, and I wanted to give the three of you a chance to plug yourselves as lawyers. So why should I become a lawyer? And why should anybody become a lawyer?
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite topics. Frankly, Marshall and I grew up in a family where being a lawyer was something to be proud of. It was a servant leadership position. It's where we serve other people. We're protecting rights. We're helping repair relationships. A lot of people don't realize that when you see a lawsuit, that's about repairing something that's broken. Or even in a criminal situation, somebody has actually done something to harm not just an individual, but our society. And what the prosecutor is doing is bringing that person hopefully to a place of repentance. And in that place, repairing our society. And so that's what we were brought up with. I love that. I every day get to help serve our community through representing an individual, helping restore justice, and with that, hopefully repairing something that was broken in our society. Because when we get a chance to see the individuals who have been harmed, or the companies that have been harmed, what we're seeing is something that breaks down our society. Well, let's just take, for example, we have a business that might be going bankrupt because of fraud that was involved. Well, that's not just the business. There's employees. There's families that are dependent on that business. There are customers that are dependent on that business. Making sure that that gets restored, that fraud is held accountable, is actually about protecting our local society. Making sure that somebody has a job. Making sure the products that were produced by that company stay available to the customers here in our community. That's what we grew up with. So I personally love being a lawyer and being a part of the system, and see it as something that's not overbearing or, I know a lot of people think of lawyers as sharks. I do not. That's not me. So as far as my thought process, I see it as an opportunity to serve our whole community.
That was beautiful.
Yeah, so I'm going to take it in a different direction.
Dun, 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 dun.
We did both grow up in a family of lawyers, and I actually promised my wife I'd never be a lawyer, and apparently I break promises. But if you look at lawyers, there are about 40,000 of us in the state of Washington. There's about 8 million people here, and we make up well over 41%. We're half a percentage of the population. We make up most of the government. Okay, we make up right now the executive branch almost in its entirety. We make up a good portion of the legislature, and we take up the entire judicial system. Okay, that is disproportionate power in this group of people. And what makes lawyers? Well, one of the things, we do have a wonderful Rule 6 program in Washington where lawyers don't have to go to law school. But outside of that, there's 300 law schools where we all spend our first semester getting brainwashed and taught how to think. And it's a good thing in many ways, because you don't want us running off the rails with this much power. You want us brainwashed. But we are all taught to be thinking then. And if you look at our U.S. Supreme Court, which holds a very strong power, they all come from 3 law schools. It's a very inbred thought process. So if you want to be in a group that has disproportionate power, become a lawyer. We really do. So that's the first thing that, you know, Brand's all about the wonderful relationship and injustice. I'm about the power, but I'm also about the fun. And I will tell you, I have so much fun being a lawyer. It is so much fun to be able to grab someone who's in a problem and say, don't worry, I got this. You may not have fun, but I'm going to have a blast. I'm going to take you through this process. I'm going to stand in front of a judge who may yell at me, but, you know, at one level or another, I know the rules. He knows the rules. We're all going to have some fun. And I'm going to tell your story. And I'm going to remind the people of the promises. This is the way I live as a lawyer. My job is to remind the judge, the jury, everyone of the promises they made to take care of our society. Remember, it is the rule by which we exercise violence. So I'm going to remind everyone, this is the rule by which we exercise violence. And then I'm going to tell my client's story, the story of why they think that the justice should go in their side. And what a fun job. Absolutely fun. And here's another key thing. You get to put people under oath and ask them questions. Okay. If that didn't pitch it to you, I don't know how to do it.
I'll just bring it back to the market and the individual market level. There is so much demand for lawyers, and it's never going to run out. We like to say and joke that there's too many lawyers and we need to get rid of them. But the fact is, lawyers like Brandon and Marshall are constantly turning work away because there's not enough lawyers to do all the work. They have to triage what work they take in and they don't take in. And that is across the spectrum, whether it's civil law, torts, criminal law, family law, government work. We can't fill all the jobs. And I can tell you, all of us who are millennials, or if you're Gen Z, it is going to be that way for the rest of your natural life. The legal field has some of the best job security that you will find for the next rest of your natural life. You will not run out of work. You will have a paycheck. You will be able to afford a good life. So there you go, supply and demand.
All right, we're going to transition briefly into a Q&A session, but before we go there, I wanted you guys in one sentence, okay, one sentence. What is a bit of a...
Drive talking to lawyers. I mean,
it might be a challenge, but one sentence, what advice would you give to your younger self as you explore this career? To all of us who are growing in our professional careers and individually, in one sentence, I know it's a big question, but in one sentence, what advice would you give?
I would say relax, because justice at the end of the day is in the hand of God, not in the hand of the judge.
Let's go.
Marshall actually stole my concept right there. I would honestly say the same thing. My job is to do the best I can for my client and trust that justice is mine.
I don't really have any advice for myself. I just tell myself to do it all over again. I have no regrets about being a lawyer, and this is a career path I've taken. Zero regrets on it, so keep it up.
Thank you. Huge round of applause for our panelists. And now we're going into our Q&A session. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand and speak it out. Yes, sir, in the back there. Please stand up.
I've used a couple of them, and I can tell you that what they're telling us is what they believe. And thank you, Marshall. We won 4 lawsuits, and Brandon together. But the question I have is, as we the people, and I think the young people should know this, is we the people are subject to both federal law and state law. state constitution, federal constitution. Sometimes the two don't look alike. And so which one takes precedence over the other one when they conflict with one another?
I'll go for that. And I hate to give you the lawyer answer, but that's who you're talking to, and it depends on the issue. And so this is the federalism that Brandon was telling us about, is that there's some issues that the state government has the last word on and some issues that the federal government has the last word on. And then there's some issues that the state government has the last word on, but the federal government's able to twist the state's arm into falling in line. And so we'll give you the example, freedom of religion or freedom from religion, one of your First Amendment rights. The federal government has the last say on that. If your state is restricting your religious liberty, the federal government wins. Whatever the First Amendment says, you have to do. And this just goes back to the constitutionalism and federal laws, and that their aim is religious liberty wins. Same thing with navigable waterways of the United States. The federal constitution says that the federal government gets to regulate those navigable waterways. So you think the 5 Great Lakes, state of Minnesota or Michigan might want to do something in those Great Lakes. They lose it. The federal government says otherwise. But at the state level, the states have supreme rights on education, educating children, hospitals, hospital districts, those things. So regulations regarding professions, the practice of professions, schools, how your kids should be educated. The states had the final say on because the state constitution says they have the final say. But that doesn't mean the state always wins. And so this is where we go back around to where the federal government twists the arm of the state. You might think about a little bill from about 20 some years ago called the No Child Left Behind Act. Well, why is the federal government getting involved in education? Why are all the states falling in line with the No Child Left Behind Act? It's because the federal government dangled a whole lot of money in front of the states and said, states, you don't have to change your laws, but if you do, we'll give you all this money. And so we did. We gave up our liberty, we gave up our rights, we gave up our control. It used to be that every state had a different drinking age for alcohol. Across the country right now, it's 21. It's not because there's a federal law that says the drinking age is 21. Each state is the first and last word on what the drinking age is. The reason why every state now has fallen into line to 21 is because Congress said, states, if you don't change your drinking age to 21, we're not going to pay for I-90 anymore. We're not going to pay for the interstates. That is how the federal government twisted the arm of all 50 states in the country to make the drinking age 21. And they do that over and over and over. So to answer your question, John, the state has some things they're final on. The federal government has some things that they're final on. But sometimes the federal government twists the arms of the state to be the final word, even if they're not.
And yeah, okay. And sometimes there's a conflict that we just live with. I mean, the fun thing of the marijuana laws that came out was marijuana was illegal in the federal, it still is, I believe, and yet it is, all the states are beginning to pass legality. And which one wins? Well, at the end of the day, I mean, it was funny, I was over at the federal courthouse after this had passed, going down in elevator, someone's lighting up a doobie, and I'm like, really, this is not wise inside a federal building, even if it's legal. But so you ask, which one do we comply with? Well, sometimes it's a source of power and money and how it works out, and that's the beauty of federalism, is there isn't a clear answer, and that's why liberty lives sometimes in the cracks and in the fights, and sometimes that works out best for individuals. It works out. We've got a lot of interesting federal state conflicts that are going to be going on into the future. And quite frankly, I'm grabbing my popcorn and watching because this is great.
Marshall's not joking about that. He's that interested in watching from the with popcorn. But I think one of the things that is important in that question is that when Judge Van Winkle said it depends, we oftentimes don't get that through the news. There is an impression that the federal government should always win out. They should always be right. And that is a big concern for me. And I think part of the problem is how much the states get entangled because they're taking funds from the federal government and they're really losing their rights. Actually, they're just giving up their rights. And unfortunately, part of that's happening because the electorate doesn't understand what the boundaries are. There's no respect for the fact that the federal government should not be involved in our education, and they are.
Representative Schmidt.
Thank you. I'll stand there. So, yeah, so I guess mine's not necessarily a question, but I'm listening to what you're saying, and I understand what you're saying, but I also will say that I'm a state representative. I work with the agencies within the state of Washington, and I am aware of situations where the state of Washington is not in compliance with federal government. So what you're talking about is there's this big stick from the federal government. They're saying, hey, you play by our rules or you don't get any money. But there also is situations where the states in Washington, I can't speak for the other states, I can speak for Washington, that know what the federal guidelines are and how they have to comply with the federal government to receive those federal funds. And they're intentionally not following them because the state has decided that they know better than the federal government, and they're not going to follow federal compliance. So what you say in that, I guess what I'm saying is, just what you said earlier is the federal government, waves a big stick, and people have the impression that the federal government has authority over the state. But we also have states that they know what their constitution is. We have attorney generals that know what their constitution is, and they deliberately defy the federal government. What do we do in those circumstances?
Harsh, can I take this one first?
You got it.
Okay.
The interesting part is exactly what Marshall was saying earlier. This is where we go in front of the judges, and this is the judicial branch. We know what the rules are. Just because you're Washington state government, you don't get to breach your contract. You don't get to get the funds and then not fulfill your obligation. If you don't want to fulfill that obligation, don't take the funds. You don't get to be above the law just because you're Washington state. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts about the law is it holds everyone accountable, or should hold everyone accountable.
What? I just had a comment on our attorney general. I don't think I've seen an attorney general or a state take the position that we are its servants, like our attorney general has continually taken in many of the cases I've been in against them. And their thing is, the people serve the government, and they've inverted it. So what do we do in that situation? Hopefully we can begin to be we the people and truly get our whole state interested in liberty. I'm surprised at how uninterested we are.
And following up what Representative Schmidt was saying about states, including this state, thumbing their nose at the federal government and their contractual obligations. Brandon's right. There is a remedy, and it is the courts. It is that third branch of government who is a check, because the courts are a check on the state relationship with the federal government relationship. The difficulty is, and one of the things that frustrates me to no end, is the courts are often just too slow and too late. Well, and bias is one problem. I'm not going to deny bias, and that's a whole other conversation. I'm happy to have the bias conversation with you. We got into that last week at the Bellevue conference, and we had a good talk about that. But it takes too long when you can make the court go into overtime so that the lawsuit doesn't get finished within the current presidential or gubernatorial administration, and then you have a change of administrations, and they say, oh, I'm going to dismiss this lawsuit now, and so you never actually get a decision. No decision is worse than a bad decision. It is no justice. And so the delay in the courts, we do have a branch of government at the federal government and state government right now, the judiciary, that is too slow and has let itself become slow and too bogged down in procedure that it's become ineffectual, that it can't actually enforce that relationship and to deal with those issues correctly. And so that is a problem that needs to be resolved. But as Marshall was saying, when people don't care, when they don't focus on the judiciary or know what's going on in the judiciary has no incentive to fix it.
And then I think we're going to one last question.
I just want to say amen to what he just said.
One last question. I saw one hand. Yes, sir. You in the back.
My name is David Mihai, and just then, Winkle, you mentioned how regarding the supply of legal services, there's a shortage, that there are matters of merit, and there's not an attorney to help with it. There's a lot of laws, and they're complicated, maybe some are bad laws, but I think there's too many laws, try not having guardrails, and the complexity of the laws is a reflection of the complexity of life. We have complicated lives, and they need rules. So my question is, should it be a matter of policy would it best serve the public interest if there would be a policy of producing more legal professionals, whether it's more attorneys in our state or paralegals who partner with them, just like medical assistants partner with physicians. And I'll just say, I see right now my two representatives are here, and it's wonderful that they're here, and they're not just sitting in their office there like, is this something the legislature should be proactive about?
Yes.
More legal?
Yes. Yes. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and it is one of the things that drives me and why I am so angry with our state Supreme Court and have been, is our state Supreme Court 10 years ago was a leader in this nation in opening up the legal profession to other professionals, to paraprofessionals. We created this program called the Limited Licensed Legal Technician, Triple LT. It's a mouthful, but what it is it is basically the lawyer equivalent of the nurse practitioner. If you go to the doctor now, a lot of times you see an advanced registered nurse practitioner. And for me, I see an advanced registered nurse practitioner, and I'm happy to. The quality of service does not suffer when you have adequate training. Opening up the legal profession from its monopoly to other people and expanding it does not produce bad results. And we can actually look to our neighbors up in Canada for that. And this is one of those things that the province of Ontario has been doing for about 20 years. We weren't the first ones to come up with the idea, but we were the first in the United States to do it. Ontario has had these licensed paralegals doing criminal jury trials. They have these professionals doing wills, doing family law, doing divorces. And they've been doing it long enough now that their sample size is statistically significant, and they don't have ethical violations with these paralegals. The rate of discipline against these paralegals for being incompetent is next to none. So it works. We know it works. But the state of Washington pulled back on it. We terminated the program. And the reason why we terminated the program was we had a switch in the justices of our state Supreme Court who were afraid that they were going to get opponents and not get reelection if they didn't sunset this program. And so they sunset this program while other states in the country are starting it themselves and doing it themselves. We pulled back because of politics. And that has been wrong. And it artificially distorts the market. And it hurts people every day because they can't afford a lawyer, because they can't get a lawyer. And so should our legislature do something? Yes, our legislature has the constitutional power to regulate professions. The state Supreme Court didn't take that power from the legislature until the 1970s. When our state was a territory, the State Bar Act determined who got to be a lawyer. A law passed by the legislature determined who got to be a lawyer. But ever since the 1970s, our state Supreme Court is the first, last, and only word on that because the legislature gave up their power wrongly.
Well, and I probably do disagree with Judge Van Winkle on this one. I don't agree with non-lawyers helping out, but I don't know if I've looked into it deep enough to totally understand what he has. But one of the problems I think we have is what we've encouraged people to do to become lawyers has shut down the pipe. I mean, I started into law school in 2008. If you remember what was going on there, massive layoffs, all this kind of stuff. And people are going into law school and everyone's talking about the massive debt they're coming out with and all this kind of stuff. So I tried to come out with very little debt. And I was great in that. So I was able to choose the law I wanted to do. But the problem is, what we tell people is this is going to be 7 years because you've got to do your undergrad in the law school, and it's going to be, you're going to have about $150,000 to $200,000 in debt, and you're going to come out and originally make probably $50,000 to $80,000, and then maybe you could make it into some stuff, and maybe we can That's not a good sales pitch, and it takes a long pipeline to get people there. But we have a wonderful program in Washington that we are not using enough. And we really, this is where I think we should increase it, is the clerkship program, where, and if anyone's thinking about law, I would encourage you to look into. It is where you go to law school and then you clerk with a lawyer. And Brandon can probably tell you way more about this because he did it. And I think it gives even a better education legally. Because I can tell you, when I went through law school and I didn't read for the day, I had my ways of hiding from that teacher. You know, they weren't going to call on me in the 30, you know, you could number it out and work it out. But if you're one-on-one with a lawyer who's mentoring you and you didn't do your reading and you didn't study, that's not going to go well. And so you turn out better lawyers. I think that's one thing we haven't pushed and we haven't incentivized. And it's actually costly on lawyers to mentor someone and to take him through that process rather than the other way around, where our law schools, they make a lot of money and it's very expensive, and these law professors make a ton of money. And so I think economically, you just put up too many barriers, and we got to tear them down. Although I am not disagreeing with your idea, Liz. Don't nothing.
Well, I think the difference is with that is you don't have a nurse practitioner doing your colonoscopy. You don't have a nurse practitioner doing your surgery. You have a nurse practitioner doing your family medicine. What Brandon and Marshall do, the complex First Amendment litigation, medical malpractice litigation, that is the lawyer equivalent of the surgery, of the colonoscopy, of that procedure. But what I see in district court, proctology, not only is he Lord Adonis, he is also Lord Adonis, legal proctologist. But there are a lot of things that paralegals with more training could do in a courtroom that a lawyer doesn't need to be doing if we would just open up the market. So it's also, you have to be strategic about it. You don't just open it up far and wide for the nurse practitioners. Even nurse practitioners have restrictions on their scope of practice.
And Brandon, did you have any closing remarks before we conclude?
Yes, I in this area, when Marshall was talking about the Rule 6 program, by the way, I do agree with the limited license and how it can be run, but I think Judge Winkle covered that pretty well. The Rule 6 program is in fact, Boaz over here is my Rule 6 fourth year, and it's a wonderful program that allows you to learn the law at the same time you're practicing. So when you come out of the program, you actually get rid of, for example, if you go to law school, it's 3 years, and it takes about 2 or 3 years just to catch up to speed on how to practice the law. So that 4 years actually cuts off about 1 year to getting you up to speed and being able to help people quicker. The problem is that first of all, it's not very expensive, but there is no real backing for it. In fact, I think ever since I was a law clerk, the Supreme Court kept on talking, well, I think we're going to cut it this year. I think we're going to cut it this year. And the only reason they haven't cut the program is it's the only program that makes money. So, but you look at that, it's really the lawyer who is mentoring, they have to give up their time to teach the law clerk. And so just trying to subsidize any of other lawyers, for example, say a lawyer that doesn't have that kind of time because we are so busy right now, how can this be helped out? And I'm not entirely sure, but I think there is something the legislature can do to encourage that program, especially since the schools get so much funding. What can we do to actually improve the way people can become lawyers?
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Brandon. A huge round of applause for them.